All right, let's get started. Without further ado, millions of beacons, intrusions for thee.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. My name is John Wolfram, and today I'm going to be talking about millions of beacons, intrusions for thee. So a little who am I? So my name, as I said, is John Wolfram. I'm a senior threat analyst on advanced practices at Mandiant. So our mission statement is to know more about our adversaries than anyone and make this knowledge actionable for Mandiant. So what that really comes down to is my team is situated at a pretty interesting place where we're supporting our responders as they are looking and investigating some of the most impactful intrusions out there. So our agenda for today, we're going to be talking about Beacon versus Cobalt Strike. We're going to discuss the differences between the two. Are they the same? How are they different? And then we're going to go into the who and the why. So what actors are using Beacon and why would they do so? Why would they use this tool out of like the massive sea of them? And then we're going to pivot from there and we're going to go into finding evil. And we're going to look on and talk about a couple different ways that you can look to identify Beacon within your network and then potentially take that hunt and move to the wild. So Cobalt Strike versus Beacon, what is the difference between the two? Well, it kind of comes down to this. Cobalt Strike is a commercially available adversary emulation framework. It was developed initially by Raphael Mudge. It's currently owned by Help Systems, and it's really composed of two different parts. You have the team server, which is like the brains for command and control, and then you have the client. And the client is what operators will use to control implants when they're going through engagements or if they're bad guys if they're operating within a network. And then you have Beacon. And Beacon is the default backdoor payload used by Cobalt Strike. So while they're related, they're not synonymous. They're not the same thing. They're different. And a lot of this is going to be kind of talking through what makes this tool and this framework so attractive for adversaries. So when we talk about the different stages of Beacon, we can look at it in two different ways. We can talk about Beacon as a stager and as a stageless payload. So a stager is a small shellcode payload that when it's executed on an endpoint, it'll perform a few checks and then query out to a C2 and pull down a full implant. And when we have a stageless backdoor or a stageless beacon, that is the fully featured backdoor. That is everything that you need to use for Cobalt Strike packaged in one. It's typically loaded into memory through a couple different ways. It can be loaded into memory through a staged beacon, like we talked about before. It can be loaded into memory through a default loader, or you can use a separate loader malware family. And one little note here, loader families, while they're super prevalent, they're not Beacon, they're different, and they're used by actors to get Beacon into memory. But you can use loaders to get almost anything into memory. And then loaders can load both staged and stageless beacon payloads. So what does that mean? Well, they're pretty agnostic, and as far as shellcode goes, they can load either. And then, or different payloads. And then once stageless payloads are loaded into memory, what do? They check back for C2 to kind of look for commands and start operating. And then when we talk about the different listeners, and this is important when we talk about how Beacon communicates outbound. So listeners are what the Beacon payload uses to communicate to their C2. And when we look here, we have a couple different types of listeners that are available. So raw TCP and SMB are what's called bind listeners. And if you're familiar with reverse shells and bind shells, that's what these are. They wait for commands to be sent to them. They're primarily used when you're chaining different implants together. So if you're in an internal environment, or an operator is in an internal environment, when you want to talk to your different implants on different hosts, you're probably not going to want to talk on HTTP between all of them, so you're going to use something like SMB or raw TCP to communicate between them. So then moving on to different types of protocols that are mainly used for communicating outbound. First one we have is DNS. Pretty self-explanatory, uses DNS for outbound communication. And then we have HTTP and HTTPS. And this is definitely the most common as far as listeners go. It's packaged with a default cert. You can use your own, but there is a default cert. We'll get into that later when we talk about hunting for Beacon, because it is pretty signaturable. And then this is probably also the most heavily customizable listener that we can look at, because there's something called Malleable C2, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, but it basically allows you to change almost everything that comprises how your payload will communicate outbound. And then when we look up how you set up your infrastructure, there's a couple different ways that you can set up your infrastructure. You can do what's called a direct connection, And that is where you literally just send a request directly to a team server. Nothing too crazy there. It's just a direct connection. You can use something like domain fronting, where you use a CDN to send so basically the way the CDN works for domain fronting, the request gets sent to the CDN redirects that request to your team server, and you have C2. And then there's domain masquerading. And domain masquerading is where you want to emulate a specific service. So in this case, what we see here is an HTTP request where it's trying to look like jQuery. This is a pretty common Malleable C2 profile used by a lot of different actors. But what they're doing is it's still a direct connection, but what they're trying to do is look like a non-threatening service. So if you're if you're a defender and you see jQuery going outbound, probably not too crazy. But if you see something like run DLL doing outbound with jQuery, probably want to look at that. And then, so kind of pivoting from that request, that's just one of the many things that you can configure when we're talking about Malleable C2. And so on the next slide, what we're going to see here is this is kind of what comprises Malleable C2. And when we talk about it, it's pretty much broken into two different parts, in my head at least. You have the C2 profile, and then you have the PE profile. The C2 profile controls almost everything that you can possibly imagine for your C2 traffic. You can see get, post, behavior, URIs, even your user agent, sleep time, everything like that. And then you have your PE profile. And this is how you can customize the in-memory characteristics of your payload, and also how your payload will operate when you're going through post-exploitation activity. So one thing to note is, like, for process injection, Beacon makes heavy use of process injection for a lot of the post-exploitation capabilities that it uses. So you can configure what process you want to spin up to do your post-exploitation activity. You can even configure your rich header hash, which from my perspective on my team, that's something that we can use to try and identify maybe related samples based on the rich header hash. You can configure, like I said, the spawn process, compile time, and even how you allocate memory, whether you want to use virtual alloc or NTMap. And what we see on the right here are two different examples of Malleable C2 profiles that were used by the Conti affiliates. So shout out to whatever affiliate dropped these on, I think, XSS, because it gave us a really great insight into how these actors are using what's out there to operate in real world intrusions. And so blowing this one up, we can see the Malleable C2 profile that these actors were using. You can see everything from the user agent string that they set, the jitter for those, and even some of those GET requests. And then blowing up the PE profile, this is another way that we can see all the things that they were able to configure. So you can see their spawn2 process that they configured, their rich header hash, even their compile time. And all of this comes down to what really makes Beacon attractive for adversaries is how much you can configure. You can really take almost anything about your payload and configure it in a way that you want. And there's innumerable C2 profiles out there that can easily help you do this with all you have to do is a git clone. So not super crazy. But what this really does is it changes the characteristics of how your payload's going to operate. It doesn't really change how you yourself are going to operate, really, at the end of the day. And that's where aggressor scripts come in. To me, I like to think of aggressor scripts as kind of like SOAR for operators. What they do is they allow you to automate workflows. They're not really adding new capability by maybe bringing in like a new function that Cobalt Strike didn't have before. What you're really doing is automating actor workflows. They're loaded into the Cobalt Strike client, so not on the actual like host side. They're loaded in the client. And what they really do is allow you to perform a lot of different checks by taking the human element out. And then when we talk about detection opportunities for aggressor scripts, it's pretty hard because most oftentimes we're not going to have eyes into where these adversaries are operating out of. And if you do, that's pretty awesome. But what we can do is look for trends. If we know that a particular actor, when they get on an endpoint, is going to run like the same 5 commands the second they get access, that potentially could be a workbook and something that we could potentially use as a single point for if we're trying to identify these actors operating. And what we see here, again, from our Conti affiliates, this is a big, I know you can't really read right now, but it's a big README from their leaks that shows a bunch of the different aggressor scripts that they're using. And now most of these, they didn't develop themselves. And actually, I'm not sure if they developed any of them, but they're able to use them because they're out in the open. And what they do is they give these actors a way to automate a lot of their workflows, because these are things that they need to use to operate fast, and that's what they want to do. And it kind of takes the human element out of it. And blowing this up, you can see an example one right here. What this is an aggressor script to basically do an AV check. This was one of the aggressor scripts part of the leak, and it's pretty simple. It takes a lot of the human element out of it. When you talk about things that could potentially tip off defenders, like typos are one, errors are one. So in this case, you take a lot of that guesswork out, you take a lot of the human element out, and it's literally just click a button and you get all the AVs that are on an endpoint. Pretty awesome, especially if you want to be operating fast in an environment to try and reduce that time to ransom so you can potentially get a bigger payout if you are a ransomware operator. But again, these aren't really adding new functions. They're allowing you to automate functions, but you're basically working within the constraints of Cobalt Strike at this point. So if you wanted to extend the capabilities of Cobalt Strike or Beacon, what you'd want to use is Beacon object files. And Beacon object files are pretty awesome because they are compiled C programs that are loaded into memory on the actual Beacon session. So as opposed to the client with aggressor scripts, these are actually loaded into the actual Beacon payload that's running in memory on an endpoint. So from a detection perspective, that's really, really hard to detect because there's not any process injection or creation where you're injecting into that. It's literally just loading it into memory. And if you're not running memory forensics, you don't get lucky with a mem dump, it's going to be pretty hard to detect. And then what we really bring to the table with Beacon object files is the ability to extend post-exploitation activity or capability. So again, there's innumerable Beacon object files out there. There's Beacon object files for almost anything. You can do a who am I, almost anything you can possibly think of, you can do with it. And they can also be combined with aggressor scripts. And so what you're seeing on the right here is an example of an aggressor script that's going to load and run a Beacon object file. This was created by Raphael Mudge, the creator of Cobalt Strike. It's on his GitHub. But this was, again, used by the Conti affiliates. We saw it in their README for one of the different Beacon object files that they like to use. This was one. And so blowing this up, what we can see here is it's not super complex. Again, you're taking a lot of the guesswork out, and all you really need to do is identify the architecture that's running on the endpoint, load in the correct Beacon object file, compile it with your arguments, and then you're off to the races. And again, this takes a lot of the guesswork out, and you're at the same time extending the capabilities of Beacon. So this is pretty awesome if you want to operate fast, add new capabilities. And it makes defense a lot harder because we're not seeing this necessarily as a process injection. And that's something to note because we looked at the spawn twos. Spawn twos are primarily used by a capability called fork and run where they spin up a process, inject into it, and get the results back. That's not what this is doing. You're literally just injecting, or not injecting, you're loading a new capability into memory, running it, and you're good to go. And so all of these are some of the different features of Cobalt Strike that make it pretty attractive to adversaries. And that kind of leads into our next point of why Beacon. Well, it pretty much comes down to this. It's customizable. As you saw with the Malleable C2 profiles, you can almost change anything. It's extremely easy to use. I was able to take a class on Cobalt Strike and Beacon, and you can pretty much pick it up in a couple hours. You can get pretty comfortable with it. And it's primarily GUI based, really easy to use. You'll see a little bit more of some of what the commands look like if you're actually operating under it. It's under active development too. And when we talk about active development, that doesn't mean just by help systems. There's a large amount of open source projects that are adding new capability all the time to Cobalt Strike and Beacon. And so if you're an actor, that's free capability that you didn't have to develop yourself. And that comes down to, it's cheaper than custom development. If you develop a capability, say it's a new malware family or a new backdoor, it gets burned by a threat intelligence company or a government. What do? Well, you lose capability because while it's still going to operate well in some environments, it's going to be signatured. You're going to potentially have the opportunity to get discovered, and you're going to eventually lose whatever you're trying to gain, whether that's espionage or money. And Crack Beacon, which is what a lot of adversaries use, is basically free. So as far as when you look at that, you're getting a lot of capability for almost nothing, and you don't really have to do any development yourself. And when we talk about attribution, attribution is hard, but when we use something like Cobalt Strike, if you're an operator, if you're an adversary, you're going to muddy the waters a lot because it's not a point that we can use as a threat intelligence analyst to say, hey, we know that this adversary uses this specific backdoor. This kind of points to them. There's a lot of different adversaries across a lot of different, like, how do I want to say this? Like, capability. There's like some sophisticated actors that use it, like the SolarWinds actors, all the way down to people that are, not super sophisticated, spinning it up to use ransomware. So it's really just a pretty broad platform that a lot of different adversaries can use. And when we go to the who's who in the zoo, we see when we're looking at it from our perspective at Mandiant, we have 5 APTs, 6 fin groups of financial crime actors, and 594 UNCs that we have attributed to using Beacon. And when we talk about UNCs, when we spin up a new cluster of threat activity at Mandiant, or when we identify like a new potential adversary operating, we cluster them unless we have like hard attribution in what's called an UNC. So it's a uncategorized cluster of threat activity. Now, that's important to look at in the sense that when we view an UNC, we may have suspicions on who it could be. And so when we talk about suspected APTs, out of that 594 UNCs, we have 23 that we've observed use Beacon. And then when we go to FinCrime, we have 22 UNCs that we suspect to be fin groups. And what this comes down to is you see a lot of diverse adversaries using Beacon, and of the like somewhat 2,500 that we are actively tracking, you see almost a third using Beacon. And that's a crazy big number when you talk about the diverse set that these actors are operating in. And what we're going to look at next is a couple profiles of some of the different actors that are probably the most prolific at using Beacon. And the first is Fin12. This is a newly graduated actor from our team. They were previously known as 1878, UNC 1878, but now they're Fin12. They moved on to the big leagues. So they are one of the most prolific operators of Beacon out there, bar none, in crime. So when we talk about how they're operating, they're extremely aggressive and they're very, very efficient. They really look to lower that time to ransom to as low as they possibly can. And when we look at how they operate, they're relying on other actors for initial access. It's pretty diverse, but a lot of the time it's TrickBot. But they almost primarily use Beacon for post-exploitation activity. And when we look at how they're getting Beacon into endpoints, they're using a lot of different in-memory loaders. And we talked about loaders earlier, but some of the examples that they were using were Maltshake, Ice Candle, White Dagger, and Weird Loop. And then when we look at how they're operating in terms of their like C2 profiles, we've observed them use a bunch, but some of them are Amazon C2 Concealer and jQuery. And C2 Concealer is probably, if I'm not mistaken, the most common one that they've been observed using. And then they like to use Let's Encrypt SSL certs because they're not going to use the default cert. So that's one profile on the crime side. And now switching gears, we're going to look at APT41, another prolific operator of Beacon. Now, what's interesting about APT41 is they're a Chinese threat group that we've observed carry out state-sponsored espionage operations in parallel with financial crime operations. So we had I think a blog that was called Double Dragon. It just kind of goes into like show that this actor is pretty diverse. They're doing a lot of different things, but they are still state-sponsored. And again, we've seen them use a wide range of in-memory Beacon loaders. So some of the notable ones are Blue Spine, Mop Sled, and Dustpan. We've observed them use a custom Cha-Cha 2.0 encryption. And then for their C2, they like to use Cloudflare CDN workers. And then as far as Malleable C2 profiles, again, they use a wide range, but jQuery, Gmail, Google Drive are the heavy hitters, with Cobalt Strike probably being the most common for them. And one thing, or not Cobalt Strike, sorry, C2 Concealer. And one thing I will note for C2 Concealer, the way that it builds profiles is it's automated in a sense, but what's interesting is a lot of the user agents that it uses are mobile phones. So you need to know your environment, but if you see a bunch of hosts that aren't mobile phones connecting out as mobile phones, that's potentially something to look at, and it's just another point to potentially identify some badness in your environment. And now that we've talked about some of the actor profiles, we've looked at some of the different ways that some of the reasons why actors would want to use Beacon in the first place, but we've also talked a bunch about loaders at this point. And loaders are really important because they're almost as significant in terms of like as far as detection goes, because no matter what, they're going to be doing like badness. And we're going to get a quick vibe check. So this was a loader. So VIBECHECK is a NIM-based in-memory loader that was used by UNC 2602 during what we call fake updates campaigns. What's interesting about this is NIM is, as far as like loaders go, pretty rare. So it was really interesting to see. And what this is a YAR rule that I created just to detect these this loader. It uses syscalls to basically do a lot of the process injection. So what you see here, the first 2 strings are pretty much specific to that project. And then the next 4 are basically a variation that kind of like lead to believing that this is going to be something bad, because it's either is getting a process ID, it's suspending a process, it's using OSPROC, which is for NIM syscalls, or it's using virtual alloc. So all these kind of lead us to the conclusion that, this is probably doing something bad. When you combine it with those first 2 strings, it gets even better fidelity. And then when we look at this as far as like the potential for expansion here, this was based off of GitHub. So this GitHub, I'll probably, if you want to know what it is, just hit me up. I'll link it. That's not a problem. But it's a part of a wider range of offensive NIM solutions on this GitHub. This was just one that we observed. I'm sure that others are being used, but this was just one that we saw that we thought was interesting, and I wanted to share a rule for you guys, you all. And now that we've talked about some of the reasons why actors would want to use Beacon, we've talked about some of the actors that have used it, how are we going to detect it? And to me, when I first looked at like trying to detect Beacon, it was pretty daunting because it's such a wide threatscape as far as like what you can use with it. So when I look at it from my perspective, I look to try and narrow it down to some of the common detection opportunities. So there are things that Beacon does by default that are pretty signaturable. And then, one quick note, that YAR rule, all that I'll share at the end of this talk. So don't worry about taking pictures. So the default name pipe is 1. There is a default name pipe that is used by Beacon, so that's one potential detection opportunity. And then some of the ways that it operates. When you look at it enough, you can see, okay, this is probably Beacon doing like GetSystem or jump PSExec with PowerShell. And what we're going to look at on the next slide is a detection opportunity. So jump PSExec PowerShell is a way that Beacon will laterally move within an environment using the Windows Service Control Manager. What it does is it creates a service on a remote system, runs a basic C4 encoded PowerShell stager, and then gets lateral movement. And what you can see in the bottom left is an example of what that looks like when you actually run it. You can see the command jump lists all the different options that you have available for lateral movement. Then we run the command, and we get another target in our belt. So when we look at detecting this, the first thing we want to look for is an event ID 745 for service creation. So then from there, we want to look for a couple different strings. We want to look for ComSpec, PowerShell, NOP, hidden, and JABZ. And JABZ is a basic C4 string that when you decode is $S, and that's part of the PowerShell stager for Beacon. And so this is also going to be on the GitHub. Share with you guys. And this is a Sigma rule, so what you can do with this is turn it into any type of detection you want, whether that's a SIM, EDR, whatever you have it. It's kind of like an open framework, and I'm a really big fan of Sigma. And so moving into another detection opportunity, we're going to talk about GetSystem. And GetSystem is one of the common ways that you can use Beacon to get privilege escalation on an endpoint. It uses name pipe impersonation to get NT authority. And what you can see here on the bottom left is another example of what that actually looks like when you run GetSystem. So we task the system to run GetSystem. It does its name pipe impersonation. We run a who am I? Who are we? We're NT system authority. So awesome. How do we detect that? Again, a 745. And then what we're going to want to look for is a CMD/C, a CMD/C, a echo, and then a pipe. And when you actually see this run on a command line or in like your logs, you're going to see a couple different strings that are like being echoed into a specifically named name pipe. Those are all generated on the fly. If you can use regex to identify them pretty easily. If you have any questions on that, hit me up after the talk. I'm happy to work with you on that. I didn't put them in here just because I honestly don't know how you use regex in Sigma, but I can talk with it after. And so these are just two of the detection opportunities that you can use to potentially identify Beacon within your environment. Now, we talked about a lot of others, like C2 concealer. We talked about some of the different ways you can look at rich hash headers. And there's an innumerable amount of detection opportunities, but I wanted to highlight some of the pretty common ones that can get you started on this path. And so if we did identify Beacon, what do we want to do? Well, we want to investigate it. So we want to investigate evil. So if we identify it running in our environment, or what we think is it, we need to be able to parse the payload, emulate it, analyze how it's running or operating, and then use those artifacts to hunt across our environment. And so that's kind of, at least in my head, how I kind of work through identifying and investigating beacon in the real world. So one of my favorite tools for doing that is CyberChef. If you're not familiar with it, it was made by, I think, the GCHQ. It's a pretty awesome framework, allows you to do a lot of different manipulation on artifacts. And then Speakeasy is another tool that I'm a big fan of. It was created by the reverse engineers at Mandiant, and it is an awesome emulator. We'll go into that a little bit later, though. So starting off, we're going to make the beacon. And what we see here is, it's probably hard to see, but you can see like the ComSpec JBZ. So this is that PowerShell stager we were talking, that PowerShell command being run. And what we see here is that being run in a big block of base64. So using CyberChef, we want to start decoding this. And again, so this recipe for CyberChef will be also on my GitHub as a gist. So if you want it, feel free to go ahead and grab it. It's pretty awesome. And what you'll first do is do a from base64. We'll do a decode, and then we'll run a regex to pull out any base64 that we get as a result. So we run that, and we get back another big blob of base64. And if you've looked at base64 enough, you notice pretty quickly that H4SI is base64 encoded gzip. So taking that knowledge and this recipe, if you take it, if you choose, you can move on to the next step in making the beacon. And what we're going to do is another from base64, but we're going to add on a gunzip. And what we're going to see here is some code pop up. And this does look interesting, and this is actually the stager that we were talking about earlier. And I know it's really hard to read, so let's make it a little easier. And so this is what the full SMB stager is going to look like. So there's a lot here, and there's a lot to focus on, but really the primary point that we want to look at is right here. So this little tidbit of code right here is really the nuts and bolts of what this is doing. And when we talk about it, that first big block of base64 is the actual shell code that this is going to be loading and executing in memory. And then in that little for loop is the XOR key. And this is really important when we talk about getting to the next stage of actually emulating this. We need to take these and use them to kind of get to the next step. And so taking that, we're going to take that, we're going to run another regex, we're going to do another from base64, and this time we're going to XOR it with the XOR key. And again, I know this is pretty hard to see, but what this is the raw output of the actual shellcode. And what we see here in red is a name pipe, and that's the name pipe that this sample itself is using for communication. And this sample, it's not super secret. I got it off of VirusTotal. You can do that if you have a VirusTotal account, or you can use something like Malshare if you don't, and just as a way to start like kind of getting through this yourself. And this is really important because this is just shows one of the ways that we can identify artifacts. But we're still not emulating. We're just looking at strings here. Another thing you could do with this, you could throw an MD5 on it, get this MD5 string for the shellcode, throw it in a VirusTotal or something like that, see if it's already been analyzed by someone else. But we want to bring home the beacon, and we're going to use Speakeasy for that. So Speakeasy, as I talked about earlier, was developed by the reverse engineers at Mandiant. It is a portable emulator for both user mode and kernel mode malware. It's really, really good at identifying key artifacts, and then you can even take it a step further when you run it, and you can dump memory from a sample. And then when we look at two examples here, we see an HTTP beacon shellcode being executed against Speakeasy, and then an SMB sample. And when we look at this, what we're seeing happening here is that the shellcode is going to open up, is going to load WinAnet, which is used for internet connections. It's going to open a socket and create a connection outbound to a 192 address. We can see the URI, and we can even see the user agent string. And when you're talking about identifying this stuff and trying to identify more evil in your environment, this is just another way that you can quickly identify some of the key points to look for across your network. And then we look at the SMB beacon payload that we looked at before, and this is just, we see here it's running virtual alloc, it's creating that name pipe, and from there we can start hunting again. And all of this is really important when you talk about being able to take like just one alert and expand that, identify some artifacts, and hunt across your environment. But we can take this a step further, and we can find evil across the Great Wide World Web. And what we can do here is use the analytical points that we identified previously through our investigation, and we can identify some more ways that we can look and potentially identify this adversary operating in other places. So one really great service that I like to do for this is called JARM. It's like a TLS fingerprint. If you identify actor infrastructure, you get the TLS JARM for that. You get the JARM for that. That's pretty great. HTTP headers are also another way that you can create a pivot point. SSL certs, that's something we'll talk about. When you look at like the default cert, if you throw that into something like Census or Shodan, you're going to get a lot of hits. If you see some of those running in your environment, probably should look at that. That is pretty well signatured though. So the Cobalt Strike server ID is another one. When you get like a license for Cobalt Strike, your server is going to have a server ID. Now, when you're running like something like Cracked, if you're an adversary, that's not legit, and that server ID could be blacklisted. So getting that could be a potential indicator that, hey, I'm dealing with something that's not like potentially a red team. And then even the Malleable C2 profile or the Malleable PE profile are other pivot points that you can use in a lot of different data sets to identify more badness. And when we look at how do we expand this out, we take our one beacon sample, and we're able to use all these different pivots to identify more evil. And so you can talk about the default cert, one potential way. JARM hash, we talked about that. Common import hashes is another way. Or using the name pipe that beacon sample is using. Like that beacon sample that we saw earlier, that was using a pretty specific name pipe, and that doesn't look super common. Or if you identify the Malleable C2 profile, and you have something like Virus Total Enterprise, what you can do is look for files that are making like requests on that same URI. And so this kind of just shows a lot of the different ways that you can take what you identify from investigations or hunts, and you can expand that out and grow your data set to identify more beacon. And so wrapping up, I want to give a couple quick shout outs. So one of my teammates, Alyssa, she created one of the best guides I've ever seen for Cobalt Strike. It's on the top there. It's really great. Then I'd also like to give a shout out to two of my teammates, Van Ta and Aaron Stevens, for their work on Spooky Rookie, so the Fin 12 graduation. And then there's a bunch of different references here. There's one for a Nmap NSE script that you can use to pull beacon configs from servers. Just note, do it over Undertrib or Tor. Don't do that from your network. And then at the very bottom, you can see the link to the GIST for the CyberChef recipe, and then you can see the link to my GitHub for signatures. And I'm going to share the talk on my GitHub. It'll be the same link. And if you have any questions like about any of this stuff and you'd like to talk to me afterwards, feel free. But from here, anyone have any questions? Nope. Thank you.